September 1944. A railway bridge spanning the Meuse River near the Dutch town of Grave trembles under the weight of German reinforcements rushing northward. The structure has survived months of Allied bombing. It has endured countless fighter-strafing runs. Yet within hours it will collapse into the black water below, brought down not by conventional explosives or the sustained effort of military engineers, but by something that began its existence as a way to store emergency rations for soldiers facing starvation. What follows is the story of how Britain's most mundane military container became one of its most devastating weapons, a tale of improvisation, desperation, and the peculiar genius of wartime innovation. It is a story largely forgotten, overshadowed by more famous weapons, yet one that reveals something profound about how empires at war solve impossible problems. The British Army in 1943 faced a crisis of logistics that seemed almost absurd in its specificity. Following the North African campaign and the subsequent invasions of Sicily and Italy, the service found itself stretched across 3 continents. Supply lines had become nightmarish tangles of bureaucracy and distance. Soldiers in forward positions went hungry with alarming frequency. The traditional tin ration, the ubiquitous rectangular container that had sustained British forces for decades, was being consumed faster than it could be manufactured and delivered. Officers complained constantly. Men's morale suffered. Military commanders understood that a hungry soldier is an unreliable soldier, prone to exhaustion, illness, and the sort of psychological fragility that leads to poor decisions in combat. The War Office tasked a small team of engineers and production specialists with designing a new emergency ration container. The brief was straightforward. Create a lightweight, durable receptacle that could be manufactured quickly using minimal raw materials that would protect its contents from moisture and damage during transport, and that could be standardized across all theaters of war. The lead designer was a career military engineer named Harold Whitmore, stationed at the Royal Ordnance Factory in Bridgend, Wales. Whitmore's approach was typically practical. He designed a compact steel box with an internal volume of approximately 2 liters, fitted with a hinged lid that sealed with a simple latch mechanism. The walls were constructed from thin-gauge steel, pressed rather than welded, which meant the containers could be manufactured with extraordinary speed. By mid-1943, production had accelerated to approximately 15,000 units weekly. Yet even as these containers rolled off the production line by the thousands, a parallel problem was consuming the attention of British military planners. The anticipated invasion of France, Operation Overlord, would require unprecedented levels of support for soldiers operating in occupied territory. Advance intelligence suggested that German forces would rely heavily on bridges to move troops and equipment. The destruction of these bridges during the initial phases of invasion would, theoretically, slow German reinforcements and give Allied forces critical hours to establish beachheads and expand their positions. The problem was that conventional bridge demolition, using engineering teams, explosives, and careful calculation, took time that might not be available. A captain in the Royal Engineers named Richard Thornton, who had previously worked in civilian construction before the war, found himself examining Whitmore's ration tins late one evening in 1943. The story of their conversation survives only in fragmentary form, a footnote in a declassified report, a mention in Thornton's personal letters, yet the basic outline is clear. Thornton was considering the properties of the steel container, its weight, its structural integrity, its consistent dimensions. He was also considering the emerging field of shaped-charge explosives, a concept that had fascinated military engineers across several nations. A shaped charge, properly configured, directs the force of an explosion in a specific direction rather than dispersing it evenly. Thornton wondered whether Whitmore's ration tin, filled with the appropriate explosive compound and armed with a sophisticated detonator, might create a shaped charge with extraordinary concentrative power. Within weeks, the concept had moved from casual speculation to active experimentation. A small team was assembled at a remote testing facility near Penryn in North Wales. The team included explosive specialists, metallurgists, and engineers. They began filling the ration tins with various combinations of explosive compounds, initially TNT mixed with other substances to increase stability and detonation velocity. The early tests were chaotic. Several tins ruptured unexpectedly. Others failed to detonate properly. The team went through approximately 80 prototypes before achieving what they considered success. The breakthrough came when they incorporated a precise copper-lined cavity into the interior of the tin, shaped so that the explosion would be directed downward with unprecedented intensity. The effect was like nothing previously tested. A single tin, when detonated against a concrete abutment, could crack it severely. Against steel or reinforced concrete structural elements, the damage was even more dramatic. The designation given to the weapon was utterly unassuming. It became known simply as the Charge Explosive Container Type B, or, in abbreviated military parlance, simply a Type B. To soldiers who would later use them, however, they were known more colorfully as tins, cans, or, in one unit's cryptic field reports, kitchen hardware. The tin measured approximately 19 centimeters in length, 12 centimeters in width, and 7 centimeters in depth. The total weight, when fully loaded, was precisely 1.8 kilograms. Despite its modest dimensions, a single Type B contained the explosive equivalent of roughly 2.5 kilograms of TNT, but with directional properties that made it far more efficient than conventional explosives for structural demolition. Manufacturing the Type B required a completely different production process than the original ration tins. The copper-lined cavity had to be inserted with absolute precision. The explosive compound had to be mixed under carefully controlled conditions. The detonators themselves were sophisticated devices, employing both mechanical and chemical triggers. Production was eventually shifted to 3 facilities: the Royal Ordnance Factory in Bridgend, Wales, a facility near Coventry, and a smaller operation in Sussex. By April 1944, approximately 12,000 Type B charges had been manufactured, though exact production figures remain partially classified. The charges were distributed to specialist demolition teams attached to various invasion forces. The Type B charges saw their most significant action during Operation Overlord and the subsequent campaign in northern France. The British Second Army, under Montgomery's command, faced particular challenges in the Norman Bocage, the dense hedgerow country where movement was restricted and every bridge and culvert became a critical strategic point. The Germans had set up defenses on the eastern bank of virtually every watercourse, and the bridges themselves became focal points for resistance. Records from the 8th Corps, which saw particularly heavy action around the Meuse crossing, describe using Type B charges to demolish or severely damage at least 18 bridges and countless smaller crossings. A private account from an engineer attached to the 7th Armored Division describes the effect with blunt precision. The sound was extraordinary, quite different from regular explosives, like a hammer striking an anvil, but infinitely more violent. The bridge at St. Lo wasn't blown apart so much as cracked at its weakest points, and it simply collapsed inward. The charge earned a particular reputation during the drive toward the Rhine. At one location near Nijmegen, a German-held bridge had been partially damaged by RAF bombing, but remained structurally sound enough to support vehicle traffic. Conventional demolition would have required bringing heavy equipment under fire. Instead, a team of 6 engineers placed 4 Type B charges at critical points along the structure's support columns. When detonated simultaneously, the charges achieved an effect that seemed almost surgical. The bridge collapsed into the river in a manner that suggested careful calculation rather than destructive force. The efficiency was precisely what had been intended in those early tests at Penryn. And yet, as is often the case with weapons developed during wartime, the Type B charges were used far less extensively than had been anticipated. If you are finding this fascinating, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. The story gets stranger from here. The fundamental problem was operational reality. By the time substantial numbers of Type B charges reached forward positions, the tactical situation in France had already changed. The rapid collapse of German forces following the breakout at St. Lo in August 1944 meant that most crossings could be captured before German engineers had properly prepared them for demolition. The weapon that had been designed as a solution to a specific problem, destroying heavily defended bridges under fire, found itself increasingly deployed against targets of opportunity. Some units used them to destroy fortifications. Others employed them for bunker demolition. A few recorded instances exist of Type B charges being used defensively by German forces, though the Wehrmacht never manufactured them independently. In several cases, captured Type B charges were simply detonated by German sappers as makeshift explosives without any understanding of their true design principles. The British Type B charges proved both superior to and distinctly different from equivalent German or American weapons. The German military had experimented extensively with shaped charge technology, but their anti-bunker charges were substantially heavier and required more elaborate deployment procedures. The American equivalent, when eventually developed, used a similar principle but was mounted in a heavier casing, more suitable for vehicle transport than hand placement. The Type B's advantage lay in its compactness and its ease of deployment. A soldier could carry 2 charges easily. 6 could be transported in a standard British pack. The directional nature of the detonation meant that less total explosive force was required compared to conventional demolition charges. This reduced collateral damage, a consideration of genuine importance when operating in occupied civilian territory. The production of Type B charges continued until early 1945, with estimates suggesting that between 25 and 35,000 units were manufactured in total, though declassified records remain inconsistent on this point. The charges saw limited use in the final months of the war. By the time Allied forces reached Germany itself, the demolition challenges had fundamentally changed. Rather than destroying enemy-held bridges, engineers were increasingly concerned with preserving the German infrastructure. Destroying it would only complicate the occupation that would follow. The Type B charges gradually disappeared from operational use, and by mid-1945, demolition teams were being retrained for reconstruction rather than destruction. What makes the Type B particularly remarkable from a technical standpoint is that it demonstrated a principle that would become central to weapons development throughout the Cold War and beyond. Shaped charge technology, refined and perfected through decades of research, would eventually enable the development of shaped charge warheads for missiles, shaped charge rounds for tank cannon, and shaped charge devices for anti-personnel weaponry. The researchers working on modern anti-tank weapons trace a direct intellectual lineage back to Thornton's observations regarding the ration tin and its potential. In that sense, this accidental innovation, born from a meeting between a simple container and a creative idea, became foundational to modern military engineering. The legacy of the Type B charges, however, remains almost entirely invisible to contemporary audiences. No surviving examples are displayed prominently in British military museums. The National Army Museum in London contains a single example, but it is catalogued alongside other explosives rather than featured prominently. The Royal Ordnance Factory at Bridgend, where so many were manufactured, is now a residential development. The testing facility at Penryn has long since been repurposed. Yet the principle that Thornton recognized, that existing tools can be reimagined for entirely different purposes, and that desperation can be the seedbed of innovation, remains genuinely relevant. Historians continue to debate the actual strategic impact of the Type B charges. That they destroyed or damaged approximately 43 documented bridge locations seems certain, based on military records and engineering surveys conducted in the 1950s. Whether those demolitions significantly affected German reinforcement rates remains considerably more speculative. The German army, despite its losses, maintained sufficient mobility to mount a serious counterattack at Falaise and to conduct organized withdrawals throughout 1944 and 1945. The psychological impact on troops, knowing that a small, easily deployed charge could destroy fortifications that had seemed impregnable, was likely more significant than the material damage. German soldiers who encountered the effects of Type B charges reported a sense of frustration, the feeling that their fixed positions had become suddenly vulnerable. The story of the Type B ultimately reminds us of something profound about human ingenuity under pressure. War creates conditions of desperation that sometimes generate remarkable solutions. A team of engineers, tasked with designing a ration tin, instead created the conceptual foundation for weapon systems that would dominate military engineering for generations. The transformation happened almost accidentally, through a casual conversation, a moment of lateral thinking, and the recognition that a solution to one problem might solve an entirely different problem. This was not the work of celebrated scientific breakthroughs or revolutionary concepts. It was the work of practical men solving immediate problems using available materials. It was, in short, thoroughly British.